everyone, and welcome to the West Virginia Shakespeare Festival Springfest. My name is Mike Murdoch. I'm the artistic director of the Alchemy Theater here at Alchemy Theater's Geneva Kent Center for the Arts. Thank you all so much for being with us. Thank you everybody on our Facebook Live. Hello. Don't send in any questions. We are not paying attention.
I've got questions.
Right, sure. So I would like to introduce our first speaker for West Virginia Shakespeare Festival Springfest this year, Dr. Jeffrey Ruff. I'm going to read his bio verbatim that he wrote for a show 6 months ago. Jeffrey is new to Alchemy Theater. He is happy to be returning to the stage after many years in youth performance, troop, school, community, and university theater. He performed in plays, musicals, bands, and competitions, including leads in Little Foxes, The Happiest Days of Your Life, Fiddler on the Roof, The Odd Couple, as well as others. He has a BA and an MA from Missouri State University and a PhD from the University of California. He is a professor at Marshall University in the Humanities Department, an award-winning professor at Marshall University, and he is here to give us a little bit of insight about Shakespeare's fairies and magic and witches and all things that go bump in the night. May I please introduce to you, with a warm round of applause, Dr. Jeffrey Ruff.
Thank you all for having me. Thanks to Mike and Nora and Stephen and everybody here. I'm obviously going to lose this coat virtually instantly. I didn't realize that I would need to, but I'm now warm. I want to thank you all. The community here at Alchemy has been a really spectacular community to get to know and to be involved with. And so talking a little bit about supernaturalism in Shakespeare, or magic in Shakespeare, it falls directly in my research area, and it's something I love to talk to students about at Marshall. And so coming here and being able to do this for the live stream and for Alchemy Theater is just a great delight to me. And we'll start with the following, say, 3 things that I always say in a circumstance like this, and that is, ask questions anytime. That does not throw me off. In fact, sometimes that stimulates us to get other people asking their questions, and so that's a great thing to do, and I invite you to do that at any time. I have enough material for approximately 11 weeks. And since we don't have that much time, I'm going to try to organize my comments around some things that go specifically with A Midsummer Night's Dream, but also a few thoughts from Romeo and Juliet, or Macbeth, or The Tempest, or even Hamlet, because there's well-known scenes in virtually all of Shakespeare's plays, but especially those ones I just mentioned, that will give you some insights into, there was a kind of I mean this metaphorically, there was an actual Renaissance, and then after that, there was a Renaissance in thinking in literary cultures about supernaturalism, and it's really found in the medieval romances of France that had an effect on sort of all the high literary culture of Europe, and the kinds of things that Shakespeare is involved with and is influenced by. Some of it is very simply speaking Celtic, Gaelic, Anglo-Saxon culture. So some of it is what's a pixie, what's an elf, what are those kinds of things in the traditional lore of that country, or those countries and peoples. But there's also this larger literary context that comes out of the medieval period, of which Shakespeare was also very aware. And also, there was a great appreciation for the Greco-Roman classics. And so when Shakespeare gives us a presentation of what we might think of as spirits, or wild creatures that have some kind of spiritual or magical nature, he's really drawing on all these different things. The sort of literary culture that he was heir to, And when I mean literary culture, this includes romance and all the genres of medieval, Renaissance, and early modern Europe. In technical terms, Shakespeare's early modern, because we think of the modern period as starting with, say, Erasmus or Martin Luther. And so, technically speaking, Shakespeare is early modern in that sense. In other schemes of history or culture, you might think of him as Renaissance era or there's different ways you can think of these things, but when I think of him as far as his ideas, I think of him as modern. And we'll return to that theme. Because there's ways in which we are still very much part of the same period as Shakespeare, despite the 500-600 years. And by the end of our discussion today, what I will get to is the places where we still believe and practice quite straightforwardly sort of a kind of we folk, fair folk sort of magic in our thinking. Theater's one of those places, to just give you a preview. But there's a couple of other places where we still have similar concepts, where our ideas haven't changed. And that gets me to sort of the first part of my talk. And what I have is I have this organized in sort of about 3 parts. And then I'm going to let you and encourage you to start asking me questions. And then we're going to go in the direction of whatever you want to talk about. But I'll start with what scholars usually call the enchanted worldview. And the enchanted worldview is very intuitive. Once I start talking about it, you'll go, oh yeah, okay, yeah, I get that. But we don't live in an enchanted worldview, not in our society. We live in a scientific worldview. We have mainstream, long-lasting religious traditions that have sophisticated theories and dogmas of supernaturalism, but that's largely compatible with, or even if it's not compatible, it sort of lives alongside a basic scientific worldview. And the scientific worldview, as in distinct from the enchanted worldview, is that stuff is just stuff. That rocks are just material, and river is just water in a pathway, and clouds don't mean anything, and the world doesn't have personality. It's just made of objects that interact according to laws and rules. And if there is important supernatural in the modern world, if there's important supernatural realities that we have to come into contact with, and we have to have a relationship with, and we have to engage with, many of those have their sources outside this world. They're transcendental or other than sort of this material world that operates according to matter and energy and molecules and stuff like that. Our ancestors did not think this way, and they didn't think this way in such powerful ways that this is one way in which it's almost impossible for us to understand them. Because, yes?
Fairies like sweet treats. For take example, these donuts.
That is true. Shall we leave some donuts out? Shall you leave a donut out on a chair over there for the fairies in case they get hungry while we're speaking?
Let's put it on a back chair so that no human notices.
So humans don't get it. Okay. All right. That is correct. One of the things, and that's in part sort of 3 of my comments, is that the wee folk or the fair folk who live unseen all around us in the enchanted world love food. And they typically love the same kind of food that children like, with a special warning that goes with that. And that is all fey creatures or elves or goblins or anything of that sort.
Can I list the sweet treats that fairies like?
Sure.
Candy, cupcakes, cake, sugary stuff, etc.
Okay, thank you. This is Samuel, my son. I didn't know he was going to be helping me tonight, but I'm happy to have a co-teacher. I teach with Dr. Kroll often in co-teaching environments, and so I'm used to it and happy to see it.
I never bring you donuts.
Well, yes, you have.
Okay.
Yeah. And in fact, Sam is not wrong. A sweet cake is the classic offering for any kind of beings.
Plus,
That-
kids like it.
And kids like it too. And the special warning that goes with this is that when it comes to fairies and pixies and elves and creatures of this type, you do not feed them alcohol or meat. If you do, you're then inviting them to be dangerous. And so if you wanted to encourage them to misbehave, you might leave out whiskey for them or something like that. And that's known historically as well. But typically speaking, milk and cake are the things that you leave out for fey creatures. And this gets us...
Is that the basis of like Gremlins lore?
Yes, yes. So as we go through this, you're going to hear things that you go, oh, that's like Gremlins, or that's like
Fairies,
Stranger
elves, goblins,
Tolkien, Stranger Things, all of these kinds of things.
hobbits, etc.
And so the enchanted world, the best way to think of the enchanted world is as if all of these words we have learned about, and think from Midsummer Night's Dreams, Puck and Oberon and Titania and the fairies and dancing fairies and singing fairies and circles of singing and an enchanted forest. Okay, that's fine. And I wasn't ready for that. Is that, hold on, I'll find it. In the enchanted world, if we think of it grammatically, and this is one of the words for scholarly or elite intellectual magic in this time period of Shakespeare and in this world is a grammar. It's what the word grimoire comes from.
Now the pixies are going to come away.
Yeah. And so, grammatically speaking, supernatural entities and fairy and elf-like creatures, if we think of them as more like a verb than a noun, and this is one of our ways in which we can metaphorically access this enchanted worldview, which we no longer possess, or we are nearly incapable of possessing. And that is, we think of the world as made up of objects that interact. And in the enchanted world, those words and those meanings are forces and feelings that move. And so, fairy, not a being, it's a place. It's anything enchanted by the fae. So fairyland, or Never Never Land, if you're familiar with that version of the story, is the place where all fairies live. And that place overlaps where we live, and it has access points that we can find. So, for example, the way in which this force of fairy or fae, which has either a correct etymology or a false etymology related to the Latin word fate. I know that's why Shakespeare uses the fates with the fairies, but yes.
Going back to the part where you said there's access points, so is like fairy circles with like mushrooms and stuff, are those the access points?
Absolutely. So all of you have seen access points to fairyland before, and circles of mushrooms. Or if an oak tree falls down and dies, and little circles of fungi and baby oak trees grow up around it, that's an access point. But also caves and famously ponds. And ponds are thought of by pre-modern peoples with all the symbolism that we have for a mirror. They are a receptacle of water, so they're a body of water, a receptacle of water. They're a place where you could fish or float or swim or find hidden things. But they also have all the symbolism that we have in terms of sort of mirror, mirror on the wall. They are televisions to the other world, or they're telegraphs to the other worlds. And so they're a physical sort of substance that you can penetrate that is giving you access to other worlds. And yes?
On the people used to use the term elfland instead of fairyland.
That is correct. The English and Germanic word is Alf, or elf. And we don't get this word fairy, it comes from French. And we don't get that until about Shakespeare's time. And in fact, Shakespeare and Spenser and others that are writing at this same time, they start using fairy and elf interchangeably at that time. In older British, Irish, Scottish, Welsh cultures, you have different words. Elf and Alf are in all the Germanic, Scandinavian, and Anglo-Celtic traditions, and we find them in very ancient place names. A place that's Albvan, Elf Valley, or Elf Hill, or Elf Grove, and we find them in names like Elgar, Elfspear, or Alfred takes the wise counsel of elves, or Oberon, which comes from Alberich, or king of the elves, ruler of the elves, or elf power, or elf sovereign, and so these words, at least for Shakespeare and for sort of, probably a lot of the folks' familiarity in English language or plays is we've got elf, fairy, which again come to be synonyms, goblin, which is just an elf. It's a particular kind of elf, and that includes kobolds, dwarves, kobolins, goblins, coblin. But one of my favorites, and I meant to mention this earlier, is the pixie. You're familiar with the word pixie. So would someone volunteer, not Sam or Lydia, because they know this story, would someone volunteer to tell me what a pixie looks like? Best guess from our culture.
Small, short haircut.
Small, short haircut. Wings or not?
Wings like a moth?
Like maybe like a moth or a butterfly?
I mean, Tinkerbell, right?
Like Tinkerbell. So Tinkerbell is, that's a 19th century image. It is called a pixie or a fairy, and it's very distinct, and we see it appear at a certain time in art and literature. But pixies are a native of Wales, and you know them more commonly as hogs, hedgehogs, because a pixie, or an urchin, which is two words for the same thing, is a little pincushion rodent. And that's what a pixie is. And then this gets, we talked a little bit about rivers, mushroom circles, things like that. That's the other place where in the enchanted worldview, the natural place to encounter goblins, elves, and pixies is in the form of animals. And how do you know if you encountered a creature of power in the form of an animal? How do you know? How?
It seems kind of smarter.
It might seem unusual in some way. Smarter. What else?
There might be a sign of some sort afterward to show you were.
There might be something that will tell you that you had some kind of mysterious or unusual experience. If they're very violent, most of our ancestors do not think of wild animals as particularly dangerous to humans because most wild animals are frightened of human beings. And so the best explanation of a rabid dog or of a very dangerous animal that intentionally or appears to maybe madly attack human beings is either ensorcelled, so that's our witch part of the, or it's been turned magically into something mad and dangerous, or it's a mad spirit who, and here's the thing, and Sam really helped us out with these donuts, because the thing is that hangry spirits are dangerous spirits. Yes?
Back to the elf, conversation. Aleph and Alpha sound similar to those.
Yes. Now, so when we're thinking about linguistic words and how they relate to each other, if they're homophones or if they sound similar or they have a similar construction, that only means maybe they're related. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes we find that alb, elba, elfa, arfer, elfen, that those are all Germanic words for elf, that they are actually related, but we're not sure if, say, they're related to the alb word in Latin, which means flat, white, the color of a swan. Maybe it has no relationship. And so just because something sounds the same doesn't give it a historical connection or a linguistic connection. It might have one, but we would have to do more study to figure it out, because sometimes those things don't relate at all. They just happen to sound similar. A lot of times we can recognize linguistic transformations if letters predictably turn into other letters, such as a J sound into a D sound into a theta sound. So theos, deos, and Zeus are all the same word, or they're a god word that's, you know, from Southern Europe. And so, or Deus is the Sanskrit version of that. And so a lot of times what we will see is that they're not exactly the same, is that there's some kind of transformation, but we can see how they work. Yes?
Alpha means leader of a group.
That's true in animals, and also pretty badly understood in our society, but I'm not going to I'm not going to run down that rabbit hole right now. However, running down rabbit holes like Alice, that's an elf story. There's old pre-modern stories about entering fairyland, chasing a rabbit. Because Puck or Puka or Buka is a well-known goblin in Ireland, Scotland, England, Wales, that loves to take the form of a rabbit, and is also known for being a rabbit with a timepiece. After in later stories, who will get children to chase him into the fairyland. Some things about fairyland. Time happens differently. So the elf queen and the elf king might get up in the morning and take a stroll, and it always be in the same forest in our world. However, for us, that every morning for them might only be once every 100 years, or only when the moon is full, or only when the stars are in a certain configuration, because this way in which fairyland is thought to overlap with our world is unpredictable to us. And this is why any kind of Rip Van Winkle type story, there's many, many, many of those in European fairy lore, of someone who thought that he was dancing with the fairies all night long, and then came back to his village and all his family was dead and hundreds of years had passed, and he was in. And so yes?
So just like in Narnia, could it would be many, many years and it would only be a few seconds in our world?
Yes. So the Narnia stories, the Fairy Queen, the Tolkien stories, most of the writers of these, and then that's subsequently influenced multiple generations of British and American authors of young adult and young adult fiction and children's stories, have studied fairy lore and Shakespeare for that matter, because, and this is a thing that I've heard Stephen say many times, and that is that if you're going to tell a story, there's certain kinds of good ways to tell stories, and you want to get the story in a way that attracts people's attention. And going through a wardrobe or into a cave and finding yourself in another world is a very easy storytelling way to make a transition to now the world can be anything I want it to be. Maybe it has 3 moons, maybe a lion rules the land, whatever it happens to be. Yeah.
On the topic of Narnia, specifically in the aspect, I guess, of more modern storytelling, is that typically where we start to see human objects be the fairy portal into the other world, or is that? The
answer to that is we don't know, not really for sure. And And I'll tell you why. And that is because another layer of this that I haven't really even gotten to yet is that some of this is very, very, very ancient, worldwide, or at least European-wide in this sense, religion. And how it thinks of places as sacred is what helps us answer this question. And that is and this is not just the pre-modern worldview. This is very ancient, even prehistoric. I mean, this is like very early historic. But we see from archaeology and from our earliest textual traditions, in ideas about the enchanted world, divine, magical, and transformative, and that's key, transformative. Transformative power is what makes us happy. It's what makes us in love. What makes us good at our job as opposed to just mediocre. It's this knack, or luck, or the right stuff, or chutzpah, or the stuff, the charisma, that the person just has that knack. And places have that too. And so the idea is there's supernatural energy diffused throughout the world. So in a certain sense, it's not supernatural, it's natural. But it's unevenly distributed. And that's the important part, is that it's everywhere in the world, but it's not equally everywhere in the world. So there might be a dry, dead old swamp that's not very magical at all. But there might be a grove of trees, especially if those trees have known medicinal or other purposes that humans use them for, that might be a more intense concentration. And this is another example of that. Faery is a kind of word, if you take all of its meanings over all, for a very long history, that it's a little bit more like a verb than a noun. And that is in the same way that if you translate the modern Japanese word for traditional spirits or deities or gods in traditional Japan, it's kami. And so that's translated as God, if you look it up in an English dictionary. But if you know how that word works, it's a verb and a noun and an adjective and an adverb. And so it's not quite an object because it can mean a funny shaped tree that grows on the side of a hill, or a fox that just happens to be smarter than all the other foxes, or God. And there's something that all those things share. And what that idea is that there's an uncanniness. There's something that's not of the home. It's not in the village. It's not in your house. It's not in grandma's cake. There's an unhomely, uncanny, not predictable stuff that is wild and dangerous. And so it is described as, and this is a sexist metaphor. I didn't make it up. I'm just going to repeat it. It's called that sometimes Fae magic or Fae power is, it's like women, fire, and other dangerous things. And again, I'm not endorsing that idea. I'm just reporting it to you. And the idea is that fire can be used to warm us, to cook our food, or we can burn the house down with. And so this uncanny Fae power is like that. It cannot be owned by human beings. It cannot be controlled. It cannot be domesticated. It can inspire us and impress us and impel us, but it can also drive us mad. And this is, yes?
Just like our feral cat?
Yeah, just like, exactly. And also, the thing is if you think about our words for animals that are wild and that we think of as misbehaving, a lot of times, if we were strictly social scientific about it, we would have a very straightforward, a kind of clinical understanding of why the cat acts this way, or why the dog acts that way, or even why a bull or a horse acts this or that way. But we don't typically do that. We typically impart to them like they're naughty or bad or misbehaving, whenever what they might be doing might be perfectly normal behavior for an animal that's used to living outdoors. that maybe we've put in a cage or a house or a, you know.
I'm gonna jump because you said something not controlled. That's the great Macbeth debate, right?
Yeah,
Whether the witches
yeah.
controlled him or he had something to do with the witches and influenced them.
Yeah, I love that discussion because if you approach that discussion as unanswerable, then you're starting to get to what actual uncanny magical stuff is. And that is magical stuff in the enchanted worldview. It reacts to you and you react to it, and it's live. But it's just, I thought about, actually forgot about it, but I intended right when we first got here to actually just ask a couple of you to move around arbitrarily to a different spot, because I wanted to illustrate that what we do, as in when we just listen to someone else and do what they tell us to do, that's some of what historically we mean by magic. So some of what historically we mean by the word magic is rhetoric. If you say something in a commanding tone of voice, and then people do something.
Or from a position of authority
Or from a position of authority.
Well, I mean, that's Old Testament stuff.
Yeah, I mean,
Samuel and Saul, they
yeah.
got into all that.
Yeah, I mean, the idea is that a human being, and I guess here's another piece of it, and this really gets to the witch part of it, and that is when a human being uses charisma in order to create more healing, healthy, wholesome, homey, safe, secure goodness, then that's considered morally good. And that's our conventional religious recognition of that. If you do kind things, if you're compassionate towards others, if you lift something for someone or help someone out or give them a gift when they're having a difficult day, you're committing acts in the world that change the world. The world reacts to you in that way. And so in this traditional view of the magical world, everything's doing that all the time. This is why you have to pay attention to what you're doing. If you use, and this is fake, I'm just acting, but if I use a, baleful stare, feared throughout history, across cultures, having someone lock eye, and I did it without my glasses, so I couldn't actually do it. I can't see that far. But if I lock eyes with you, that might be to tell you something really true and sincere, but it could also might be because I'm trying to beguile you. And you can't know the difference, because sincerity and malevolence are indecipherable from each other in this context, because they both rely on you believing me. Yeah.
So this makes me think of it. Historically, is there any real difference between the concept of a saint versus a witch? Or is it really just like the sort of result of what you do?
It's a fantastic question. I teach this class called Shamans, Wizards, and Saints, in which I look at this phenomena over the history of civilization. And by civilization, we're usually meaning since we have texts that we can read about stuff, even though human civilization is much older than that. And one moment. And so the difference between a midwife and an abortionist is depending on who you ask in the village and what you ask of her. And if someone has that knowledge, so follow the train of thought here, if someone has that power, they have a power that other people do not have. If you know the secrets of birthing, then you know both life and death, because sometimes birthing doesn't work out for the baby or the mother. is in a pre-modern, pre-hospital context. And so knowing those secrets, being a doctor of that sort, means that you already have the knowledge to either be a saint or a witch in advance, because you practice in this uncanny borderline of life where you deal with life and death.
Well, that's what makes a hero, right? And versus the villain in all of mythology.
Well, and see, you know, our best, one of my favorite villains in modern fantasy is Darth Vader, because he's sympathetic in so many ways, and especially if you think through him all through, you know, that character, you know, utterly villainous, especially when we first encounter him. But if you think of him as a tragic tale, you see this is the kind, and this is what mythology and storytelling is so good at. All storytelling has silly, simplistic, easy to understand, cartoonish versions. And some of that is, how big's your crowd? How much do they have in common? What are their ages? So sometimes you have to make it really simple, and the villain twirls his mustache and wears black because you're making it real simple. You know, and he, you know, ties, you know, young maidens from the village to, you know, trees during the flood, or if it's a modern story, you know, to the railroad tracks. And mustaches. A long history of mustaches being associated with villains. It just happens to be true. I'm not endorsing that necessarily either. But and so the difference between the villain and the hero is the hero's moral choices. Or, and this is about 50-50, or the hero's accidental choices that he discovers afterwards were courageous. Or she discovers that she did the right thing in hindsight. And then that's when they come to say, oh, I have done the right thing because I approached this unpredictable world in a certain kind of way. Not that I knew what was going to happen in advance, but that how I approached it and the kind of decisions I made when I encountered things. And in certain senses, that's some of our difference between tragedy and comedy, is that in tragedy, we're rigid and inflexible. And we can't change when the circumstances change. And then the story goes bad for us, whether we're Antigone or Oedipus or Lear. It's because we can't give up on the path that's no longer viable. However, Oberon in A Midsummer says, "Oh yeah, this has all gone wrong. let's reverse all this. You know, oops, uh-oh," and that willingness to just back up.
So that's my next question. In the Fae world, is it morality, or is there an animalistic quality that the ancestors assigned to them?
Yeah. So a lot of what we see is today, and this really is modern, and so this comes from since the Protestant Reformation, really. So we're talking about a particular set of intellectual ideas that have been developing for, say, the last 500 years. We understand morality differently in the world today. And so for ancient peoples, the Fae are moral, and they're good and bad, but they're not purity-oriented, or they're not ascetically moral. And I'll explain what I mean by that here in just a second.
Yeah, because I guess my question with that is it not morality, but like the force of law? Because if you engage in a contract with a fairy, like there's no way to break it, or if they make a promise, there's no way to break it. And so the law is amoral in that sense. So is that related to what you're saying here?
Yeah, I mean, I love that, because one of the things that human beings are famous for is entering into agreements with spirits, either to learn to play guitar or to find the hidden gold. or whatever it happens to be. And that's a classic fairy tale story. There's usually a loophole, like the Rumpelstiltskin loophole. There's usually a loophole, and it's comedic or absurd. And so, so it is that the Fae creatures are kind of bound by a sort of legalism that's their magical world. Like they're committed to do what they say they're going to do, and they have to keep their promises. A lot of times when you hear in epic poetry, which is an older genre, there's all these curses. People get cursed all the time, and you can't quite fix a curse, so you can't take a curse back, and so you modify the curse in some sort of way, and that's also connected with rhetoric. And so law and rhetoric and ancient understandings of those kinds of things, like how we use words, and that words have force and power and meaning that is not cannot be dismissed casually. But what we see with morality, or what we think of as psychological morality, which we start seeing about 2,000 years ago, very prominently depicted in the Christian community and the Buddhist community. You see this articulation, and I'll give the distinction with the fairies here in just a second, but we start seeing this articulation is that you got to get the feeling right. It's not that you got to get the rule right, that you've got to get the feeling right. So if you say one thing and do another, that's immoral. That's not really moral or not moral in the ancient world, at least according to the text we have. Doing what you say, or saying something and not doing it, that's moral or immoral in the ancient world. Saying something and not meaning it is more like what we think of as related to morality and immorality. And that's a distinction that we do not find in the ancient text. It's a psychological distinction, but we do find it in more than one culture. You find it in Christian psychology, you find it in Buddhist psychology. I mean, you start seeing it, and we start seeing it in the era of empire. And so one of the scholarly explanations is that we no longer have religions and cultures of place strictly. And before empire, the gods are the gods of my place and my family and my ancestors. And so that's why they're also tied to this pond and this grove of oak trees, or that dead spot in the swamp that we're all scared of, because that was the place where these tribes or peoples lived. And so what happens is, in the modern world with scientific worldview and rationalism, we tend to get anti-supernaturalism or anti-superstition. And so like all the little pixies and fairies and stuff, that's sort of children's stuff or silly stuff. But one of the unintended side effects is it also gets farmed out of the major religious traditions. And so the major religious traditions like Islam or Christianity or Buddhism or Hinduism, they have all these little spirits. They're quite peaceful with all these little spirits in all kinds of times and places throughout history, and do not strictly think of them as demonic. As often as not, they think of them as not governed by the covenants. And so they end up in a limbo world, a fairyland. They're an other that are sort of not governed by the human, regulations. And yes?
Back when you said the dead spots in the swamp, does it mean like people died in the swamp?
Well, there are some places where no plants will grow. Human beings historically get scared of that. If there's a place in the lawn where all of the... Now, it might today have been we parked a truck there that had a leaky oil pan, and then we got that hole in the yard. But if there's no leaky oil pans, and then there's just a spot of grass that is dead, human beings were disturbed by that historically, because that's a place where life is weak and death is strong. And places, although we know swamps or ecologies where there's lots of life, there's also a lot of dying things and rotting things and spoiled things and smelly things.
So we talk about in class sometimes how ancient holidays, like in Rome, they had this idea where if something bad happened on a certain day, that day was always holy and was supposed to be respected. Are time and place similar in that
Yeah,
way?
so time and place in these non-imperial or non-universal types of religion. So what happens with empires is they develop religions, and Christianity is an example of this that we're familiar with, that it can be for anybody in any place. So it doesn't matter where you're from. And that's a new concept at that time in history. That's not, there's no concept of that sort 10,000 years ago or 20,000 years ago. There's no idea that there's a one system of belief for everyone. That comes when multiple populations were moving around in an empire and they no longer necessarily had a place. They were living in a foreign land forever, like for the rest of their lives, living in Spain or Italy or whatever, and they're originally from Egypt, and they're never going back to their home. Well, they got traditions that didn't have to be located in a place. And also time is considered the same way, and human beings have a many millennia old facet. Some of our earliest pre-writing scribblings are star maps and weather patterns and what look like math and calendars. And so human beings have been keeping track of where they were with the stars or what time of year it was for longer than we've had record-keeping type writing, because we have much older versions of inscribed bones and stones and things like that, that if you analyze them mathematically, it's a calendar, or it's a way of keeping track of time. And time can be good because it's lucky or it's unlucky. And so sometimes place and time, again, we've talked about how the power of supernaturalism is unequally distributed. That's in time and space. And so there are times of year that are more dangerous. The shortest day of the year is dangerous because we don't know if the sun's going to come back. And that's not because they're scientifically stupid or they didn't know the sun was going to come back. It's because they have stories about that going wrong.
Speaking of like shortest days of the year, or like longest day of the year, either solstice, I've heard stories of those being like times that this world and the other world fade together. How common is that in?
That's almost universal.
Okay.
In cultures that we have writing and they keep track of things and their calendars and their math and their sciences and their religion, like we've got a pretty good library. They all have this concept that if something unusual happens in the sky, such as a comet or an eclipse, that you have to pay attention to that. They don't have the same attitude about what it means. It could be good luck, it could be bad luck. There you'd have to be in a particular place and time and see how those people regarded that issue. It's not universally that eclipses are bad. It's just that there's something. And oftentimes those are considered that the veil is thin between all the worlds. And so what we think of as Halloween is a time where you leave cake and milk, or in this day and age, candy and cookies, out for the things that go bump in the night so they won't get too rowdy. If you wanted them to get rowdy, you could leave them out meat and blood and alcohol, and they'll tear up some stuff.
Caesar goes on and on about that before he gets put away.
Yeah. Yes?
So can elderly people who are about to die or something, can they sense if the veil is?
According to all of these traditions that we're talking about, there are many traditions in which children, elderly people, the insane, and people that completely commit their life to their religious tradition, like monks and nuns. So monks and nuns, elderly people, children, and the terribly ill or insane have a higher likelihood of being able to sort of, see the Fae creatures.
So I once met this person in nursing home, and she came to me and said, "Oh, you were so sweet," and then she just started talking about a veil, and I thought she was talking about her wedding or something.
Well, you never know. It's the thing is that
but
Be-
then, like she said, the veil is very thin.
Yeah, you know, this, yeah.
In the book Orthodoxy by like T.S. Eliot, he talks about how the insane sometimes are the most sane. And do you think that could kind of, is that similar to they're insane, so they're like seeing the veil?
Yeah.
Raising?
So that brings me to point 17 on my outline of what is elf shot. One of our oldest words for things to do with elves are about illness. And so the pretty broad, there's a pretty broad theory of illness across the Indo-European traditions. And so that's not just Europe, but that's, you know, Persia, India. I mean, that's an even broader part of the world where illness is explained by dangerous spirits, by demons or creatures or malicious spirits. And this is very ancient, and it gets replaced almost Indo-European wide by the Greek system over time, which was derived from the Egyptian system. That's a whole nother set of lectures. However, basically the idea is, in Shakespeare we hear about the humors. That system becomes, or a system like it, becomes the widespread medical tradition with alchemy, so after our theater. So alchemy and humor medicine are the intellectual traditions between the ancient world and the modern sciences of psychology and medicine. So alchemy evolves into both psychology and medicine, and those humor systems is part of psychology and medicine. And so so this word elf shot, which means pox or pains or suddenly sick without an explanation, means that, you know, you've been attacked by elves. And of course Cupid, you know, uses the same method. And this gives us, I think, one of the most interesting parts of this whole workshop, and that is one of the distinct things that we lose with shifting to the modern worldview from an enchanted worldview is we kept madness, but we didn't keep divine inspiration. So our ancestors believed people could be out of their minds, and that was a special state, dangerous, confusing, potentially harmful, but also creative, inspiring, original, allows you to see things that others can't see, might give deep insights. And so this poets and madmen sort of idea, that's a very, very old idea, and it changed in modernity. Because in modernity, being not normal or having a pathology is only coded as a negative, even if it may have lots of varieties, and even if in certain discourses we're changing that maybe today with certain discourses about neurodiversity and things like that, we may be beginning to think differently in some ways about this. But our ancestors thought about people who saw things differently might be bats, or they might know something we don't know, and it's from the gods. And you can't tell the difference, just like in a dream. If you have a dream and it comes true, how do you tell the difference between that and then all the dreams you ever had that didn't come true? You can't. But that's because dreams are the same kind of things. It's that dreams can give you access to the Fae world or the supernatural world or the divine world. And also sometimes dreams are indigestion. And there's no way that you can tell in advance. You can only tell after the fact of whether you thought it was a propitious dream or a predictive nightmare or, again, just too much roast beef. Yes?
I have 3 things to say.
Okay.
Okay, the first thing is the word silly comes from a Fae term, aka the Sealy Court.
That is true.
Also, when like the divine world view about ancient, do you mean like Bronze Age, Stone Age, Iron Age?
Well, that is a longer conversation that we could talk about after the talk.
Dinosaurs.
Okay, I got you. So typically,
Also,
one more, and then I'll take this one, and then I'll take one from someone else.
okay.
Thank you, please.
The connection between space and time is space-time.
Sure. Okay, I got it. I got you. I see where you're going with that. So, human beings have lived in settled civilizations for about 12,000 years. They've lived in what we might think of as cities for about 5,000 or 6,000 years. They've had empires for the last 2,000 to 3,000 years. And so we see some distinct social changes in our ideas about how to live our lives and how we trade things back and forth, or how we get along with someone who doesn't speak the same language as us, or what kind of sciences we share or don't share. So like whether we have a 12-based system or a 10-based system, which we have both in our society. Question, I'll return to that.
So in Sam's bringing up the Sealy Court, that made me wonder, where do we see things like courts of power begin, fairies having specific names, like Puck also being known as Robin Goodfellow, Oberon having the name Oberon, King of Fairies, the Sealy Court, the Unsealy Court, the goblins, and so on and so forth?
Goblin or elf or even Alfriga or some kind of elf king word, those are old. We have them in the medieval period, and we also, again, we have them in all these place names, and place names are often very old, or surnames, which are connected sometimes to place names. And so what we see is that with the medieval romances, which were literature, songs, literature, romances, plays, what we see is we get a simplifying of these things, and there becomes a king and the queen, or a high king and queen of sort of all the fairies. And Oberon and Titania represent this sort of the king and queen of all fairies everywhere. Before that medieval romance literary period, there's a king and queen of every hill, of every mound. So one of the other words for elf or creature or being is white, which if you've ever heard that term, it was probably as Barrow White in Tolkien, who were the ghosts that lived in the burial mounds that threatened the hobbits. And so white, and Shakespeare uses the term white, it means sentient being or person, but it also is used very specifically to refer to Grendel in Beowulf, and if a young woman is particularly beautiful, she will be described as with some beauty word in white, and so it means creaturely or sentient being, and so whether something is a ghost or a spirit or a goblin or a creep, and an elf or a fairy or a whatever, that is not a pre-modern distinction. None of those things are distinct. They all are transformative, and they blend into each other, just like they can change in the shape of animals. And so there's not. So the Sealy and the Unsealy Court, that's medieval Christian Europe. That's starting to cultures don't usually throw out their old stories, but they do rethink them when they get a different way. And so they divided the fairy world into the Sealy Court, which is silly and weird, but like singing and dancing. Basically, they love to eat and sing and dance, and if you have a party and you have just the most basic respect for them, they will bless your house with blessings. So when you're done singing and dancing and you go to bed at night, they come out and dance and sing and dance and bless your house with wealth, fertility, happiness. And so that's the silly court or the Seelie court. It's those happy fairies that just love a good party. And then the unseelie court have a very distinct set of characteristics that you will all recognize. They fly through the air. You hear them with the sound of horns and bells and in strange keys. They grab people in the night from their beds and fly them around. They steal their body fluids. They give them wasting diseases, depressions, like they felt like they slept all night, but they wake up and they're all haggard and tired. And so the unseelie court is famous for its draining the life out of people. And while they're doing that, they're also known to mutilate cattle and livestock with elf shot. They are known to make circles in the corn, too. And so all of our kidnapped and body probed by aliens stories are all old elf stories that in a scientific worldview. So we don't believe in elves anymore. We don't believe in magic, but we do believe that they could come here in a spaceship and steal our body fluids and damage our cows. Yeah.
I was gonna ask about that earlier. Is like, do you think since we've shifted to more of the scientific worldview, all of our kind of like fantasy stories have shifted more into like the scientific sci-fi vein, which is why we have things like Star Wars, where you have like Jedi and different things?
Yes, science fiction, fantasy, horror, and romance are all derived from the same culture that produces Shakespeare. It's all the same kind of literary culture, and so a lot of our genre fiction, there's certain new things in the last few hundred years, like the detective story that gets invented, but it's out of the horror story that it gets invented, and so horror is fantasy in which our opposition is overwhelming and we will not survive, or only few of us will. Fantasy is our opposition is overwhelming, but with a good heart and this fellowship, we can overcome anything. Science fiction is a modern post-scientific revolution rethinking of those categories, and it doesn't have it sorted out. And so science fiction can be philosophical, it can be horror, it can be overwhelming, it can be cold and brutal, it can be cheerful and fantastic. The Star Trek, for example, is an example of a cornucopia universe, and that is you with science and cooperation, you create two cornucopia technologies, transporters and replicators. And then you remove all human suffering. You don't need money anymore. There's no class system. That if you have cornucopia technology, which we'll get from invention and cooperation, then you can explore. And that's why the captains are all fans of Leonardo da Vinci and Shakespeare, and because they're cultured, because the object of human life is to explore and be cultured, and all we need is unlimited energy, or at least widely available energy and widely available survival resources. And if we have that, then we'll just all become poet sailors on the sea of fate to discover. And it's a dream, and that's a science fiction, but that's very much a fantasy in terms of its utopian view. On the other hand, something like Blade Runner is a dystopia. It's if we keep doing what we're doing right now indefinitely, and we survive as a species, like if we don't go extinct, then it's just going to get crappier and crappier and crappier, and we deserve it, and it's our fault. And so science fiction has all those. Science fiction is our attempt to make sense scientifically of 5,000 years of fantastic literary and dramatic theatrical culture, or the storytelling traditions that we inherit. And that's one reason why there's so much good stuff. Like there's so much creativity in our world, is because people are actively experimenting. We have access to so much of all this storytelling. And sometimes it doesn't go that well, but it also does go well. And that's part of sharing it. Yes?
I have two things to say. Now, about like courts and courts of power, like the scene where Aegeus in Midsummer Night's Dream on Act 4, where Aegeus gets removed of his right to demand who his daughter is dating.
Yes.
That's like court. Also, another thing, I can tell you one thing that's science fiction.
Well, let's not do that right now, okay? You can tell me about that here in a little bit, unless it's about fairies.
Wow.
Okay. yeah. Let's skip that. Yeah. Let's skip that for now. Going back to the sort of courts I brought art materials. I didn't know what kind of crowd we would have. The Pixies brought the art materials. The Pixies brought the art materials and the donuts, and some candy. Because but I didn't originally know what the crowd would be, and this gets back to your question about court, or your question about court, and that is one of the things what we see is that these little spirits that are close to human life, and that's really what this is. These are not gods of the universe. These are gods in old archaic religious senses, and they later become angels or saints or intermediate beings. Like that changes over time. What we do is we redress them in our culture. And so Puck in our Midsummer Night Dream, I love that because it's exactly right. Because you don't want to dress, Puck in, so anybody know what the classic dress of a leprechaun is? Like the tricorn hat and the colonial green jacket. He looks like he's either a British soldier that got lost on the way to the Dyer, or and so that's what you'll see a leprechaun depicted of. But before the modern period, we didn't fix these things, and so a fairy wasn't something with butterfly wings; it was something that changed its form, and it looks like a tree, or a maiden bathing in a pond, or a bird, or a fox. Now, there's usually a trick. Almost all fae creatures have some tell that's baked into the storytelling tradition. So that is either they're two-dimensional, so if you walk behind, like if you get right on line with them, they disappear because they're not actually three-dimensional, or they're hollow on the backside, or like the Japanese version of this is they always have some number of foxtails. Yeah. And you can go, a beautiful maiden that you're having a great time with, just make sure to look at the back of her skirt to be sure that you're not really in like a cave surrounded by straw and bones. And that's another part of this lore. And so I guess I want to say three things with that, is they usually have a tell. Fairy tales are famous for us thinking that we came out with gold and a magic wand, and we realized that we have a broken coat hanger and some, acorns, afterwards, because that's the Fae world, is they can change things, and the Fae are not possessive. They're jealous and possessive in the simple, like, emotional sense, but they don't mind sharing their stuff in all kinds of ways. But their stuff's not valuable, actually. because what their actual stuff is the singing and dancing. And so we think gold is valuable. The Fae have a lot of gold because they live underground, some of them at least. And so they can give us that, but they also might give us a handful of tin or, again, acorns, because it really does make, but they're not greedy in that sense.
There are rules about that, right? Like, never take a deal from a fairy.
You shouldn't eat. And this is one of those places where the same rules for the fairies is the same rules as going to the world of the dead. And that is, you don't eat there, and you don't take gifts from them. And I paid Puck the other night. It disappointed her, but I usually keep some silver with me all the time, because if you pay a Fae in silver, you are not obligated or trapped by their. You can also use other things like St. John's wort. I mean, so there's all kinds of little plants that break their spells, or a four-leaf clover can break their deals or break their spells. And that's a part we didn't really get that much into, but there's all this plant lore that's about. So the tri-colored violet, the little pansy that grows wild in the yards around here, that's the flower in A Midsummer Night's Dream. It's in one of its, and it's got a whole bunch of names, but one of them is the one that Shakespeare gives us.
Love and idleness.
Yeah, love and idleness. That's one of the classic names for that, and that's a fairy flower. And so this is a good example of Shakespeare layering in these cultures, because that's an old fairy story, and he tells the part about the fairy, tells the story that it's Cupid, that like he adds this Greek version to it. And this is one thing that the medieval romances and Shakespeare and Spenser and other of these people that they're really good at is they're just gathering up the fantastic from all of their sources and making it all work together.
Is Ariel in Tempest unusual? Because Ariel's by himself. Like that, from what you said tonight, I hear a lot of team and court, but Ariel's by himself.
Ariel's very unusual, and we don't really truly, and I'm talking about sort of the literary scholarship, especially the religious studies side of the literary scholarship, is that we don't really understand what Ariel is, because there's something very unusual and creative about what's going on with that character. It has some things in common with what was coming out of the New World. Early knowledge of these new cultures that so in the School of Salamanca in Spain and other famous, that was probably the most famous, but in these big academic institutions, they were trying to figure out what Native Americans were when they met them. Everything from the lost tribes of Israel to not human beings at all, to some kind of fae or elven creatures, or people that never fell from grace, like they were a pure people that were not governed by the old world's fall from grace, and so they had serious academic ongoing debates about what these creatures were that they encountered that were so different, that were more different than going to India or China. They were so different that they weren't sure what kind of beings they were, and Montaigne writes really interesting things in essays. His essay of Cannibals and Coaches treats some of this, and some of the stuff in The Tempest, to me, looks like conversations that are going on in Europe about this new world, this new place. Like some of The Tempest makes me think of, and that just makes me think of that there are people, they're lively intellects having conversations, and Shakespeare's drawing on different things.
I think it's interesting too that as far as the Tempest goes, because Caliban is also sort of by himself, really. But the fact that a human wizard has enslaved a fairy in Ariel's aspect, is also sort of a
studied magic and alchemy and whatever, enough so that he could capture his own fairy
Yeah.
and make him do his bidding.
Well, I mean, he's powerful. He created a tempest.
Right. I mean, he clearly he's not a joke wizard. Like he's not a Copperfield wizard.
Well, and go ahead.
But that's it. I think it's interesting because of how Shakespeare has grown in his studies of this type of thing as it goes.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that really makes the wizard a different character than the witch in literary and theatrical history and lore is that it's really the alchemist side of wizardry, and that is it is scientific or proto-scientific. So anybody know who the last professional alchemist for the King and Queen of England was?
Isaac Newton.
Sir Isaac Newton. His day job was alchemy. So, our first chemist, physicist, was also our last alchemist in a quite straightforward way. And so the wizard who commands nature. See, it's usually Oberon and Titania having an argument that makes the weather change. But a human being that can command nature, that's something different. That's imparting, and that's really a hybridization of the high culture of Christianity and the emergence of sciences, and it's all this literate culture that's imagining that we'll bring the world under our control. And so that's all of putting all that together. It's like Shakespeare's thinking about stuff. Like he's not just like reading some old French romances and plagiarizing, Well, sure, but
Well, the tempest is unusual for him as well.
I really think it's a brilliant piece, and it's a meditation on the changing world that he was living in, where it's going from the medieval period into modernity, because the Tempest seems like a modern story to me, and Midsummer seems like a medieval story.
I think that those two plays themselves are very different from everything else that he wrote. There's such a
They're the magic plays.
right. They're the magic plays. So it's, there are a handful of others, but in all the rest of them, the magicians aren't real. They're hucksters. They're And in these scenarios, they're the real deal. And how do you deal with that?
Yeah.
That is, and everybody else has to sort of live in that world with them. And how do you live in the world with the fairies? How do you live poorly for the most part? You're the human being.
Right. Right.
But the cool thing about Midsummer is the fairies play their tricks, and then at the end, he's like, "Go bless their bed."
Yeah.
He's like, "We had our fun. Go bless."
Well,
their bed."
and that's part of this uncanniness and that was the much earlier distinction I was making between sort of high morality, sort of psychological morality, and old school simplistic morality, and that at the end of the day, the fairies want you to flourish. And if there's an especially nasty one, you need to watch out for those with four-leaf clovers and milk, and so you want to ward those things off. But for the most part, you leave the milk and cake out for the blessing, like the little elves that fix your shoes at night too. It's like, and so hobgoblin means house elf. And that's an elf that is in civilization, not not woodland. So one of the specific things about what a hobbit, hobgoblin, kobolin, cobbler, kobold, these are all things that are little elves that'll help you around the house and help you around the field and help your animals. And you got to treat them with respect. But some of that is just a kind of mindfulness ecology. would be maybe a word we might describe it, is that the world is uncanny, and you have to have a certain kind of respect for it. You got to respect the danger of the river, and you got to respect to get the cows in when the weather's, and that if you don't, think the sickness will occur. And so at the heart of most ancient religious traditions, wellness and illness, of which people getting along and not getting along is just the psychological end of the wellness and illness spectrum.
This is a hard pivot, but I have to ask it because we live in West Virginia, so it's very important to us. In talking about fairies and then kami in the East, are cryptids our modern day version of what a fairy would be?
Maybe. I mean, to a certain extent, yeah. Appalachia is has a very vibrant and living little supernatural tradition. And by little and big, I simply mean the one that's by that pond over there, as opposed to commanding the whole universe. And so a great deal of this area blends West African culture, Native American culture, and a whole bunch of this Gaelic, Celtic, Anglo culture. So Irish, Scottish, Scotch-Irish, Welsh, British, and then with a healthy dose of German culture generally. And you throw all those cultures in a pot for 500 years and stir them around, and you get holler magic as we quite straightforwardly have. It's in certain senses a Christianized hybrid fusion tradition of all these, because it has a lot. So in contemporary Appalachian magic, it's basically Christian. I mean, there's a whole bunch of Bible stuff that goes with it. So it's completely fused in the same way that you would have found in early modern Ireland, where so there's ultra modern forms of Christianity that are touchy about elves and Santa and Christmas trees and like all these symbols of old traditions that sort of got, or the rabbit, the March hare being associated with Easter and stuff like that. But traditionally speaking, most peoples didn't worry about that. That was just part of it. That's just the little tradition. And, the big tradition, Jesus and the saints. This is just the little tradition, is that, my sick cow, or predicting the weather. How long are we supposed to do?
It's whatever you want.
I am happy to continue for as long as you have questions. So, huh? Okay. Okay. First off,
I have a question. So we originally kind of made the distinction between like modern thought is more scientific and like stuff is stuff, and then in the past it's more enchanted. Do you think that could have come about by the loss of our culture, like losing the oral tradition, like the bards sitting around the fire, telling these stories and connecting it to the earth and the ground and fae?
I want to say something like yes, but. Yes, but we haven't.
Yeah.
Because if one side of my family is musical, and I spent most of my growing up in the Ozarks of southern Missouri, which is basically Appalachia West, both historically and culturally. And we sat around on the weekend nights, and somebody pulled a fiddle out, and somebody pulled a guitar out, and then somebody came from across the street, and somebody else from down the street brought food, and then everybody's just playing music and singing, or somebody's telling a story. And my grandfather was an extraordinary storyteller, and some of them were stories about the time that they caught all these trout, so it was some, maybe true story, and other were stories of folklore and folk heroes and outlandish things, and so. So we do still have that, but very, very especially, we have three things that are very much like our ancestors, and that's the public, shared music festival, of which Bonnaroo is the giant version, but think more like the smaller local regional ones, of where it's like that, but they move around in the different places and times. That's very much pre-modern. That's a very old style of human beings getting together and telling stories, playing music, and dancing in circles, just like the fairies. The other two places where we have not lost this pre-modern sensibility is that we believe in romantic love, and quite straightforwardly recognize it as a kind of madness. And if any of us have ever felt it before, we were quite mad, and we knew it, and unapologetic about that. That pixie shot, that elf arrow, still quite straightforwardly, we celebrate in our society. And then the third, so the public music festival, that's the old religious festival of history. That's the pre-modern pilgrimage festival of history, widely shared, local talent, singing. So if we only needed one set of love songs, we wouldn't rewrite them every 10 years. And it doesn't matter. Like, we have to do that because each generation has to take that millennia-long storytelling tradition and make it their own. And one of the most straightforward ways in which we do that is in our popular music. Because popular music can move faster than academic music or academic theater, or it can stay experimental and sort of move quickly. Our impressions of how we fall in love and how that works. And then the other one is theater. Or broadly speaking, the creative arts are a place in which we believe that we can be inspired, possessed, or moved. And the language we pick to use that is from our old magical language and our old religious language. That means to be inspired by the goddess or the muse, or to be inspired by divine sensibilities, what the Greeks called gnosis, the kind of knowledge that makes you different, that changes your life, that alchemically transforms you into a different kind of creature. And so in that sense, we have some important pieces of our old oral tradition and our old living, creative, transformative tradition. But it comes through in sideways ways, and it comes through in certain kinds of ways, and it doesn't come through very well in other kinds of ways.
Well, they all require action.
Yeah, I mean, you have to.
Talk about verb versus noun.
Yeah,
These are all verbs.
You have to do something in order to be creative, and so if you think about how, for example, how risk adverse our society is psychologically, economically, just so across the board, to transform one's life, one has to take chances and fail spectacularly and colossally, and then keep going. And that principle is known. If you're a painter or an actor, you know that principle. You're not troubled by that principle. But if you get that grade on your math report, you might be incensed. Or, from your mortgage lender, you might be incensed. Yeah.
So this is not really about what we were talking about this minute, but I was just wondering, do fairies have a lifespan?
Oh, typically speaking, the way in which these kind of entities are understood is they're not invulnerable, so they can be killed in a fight. And they like to play sports and get drunk, and they might fall off a horse and break their neck. I mean, they're vulnerable to damage or illness or certain kinds of things, but they're basically immortal. Like, they don't die of natural causes. But that's also that squishiness about a day in their world might be hundreds of years in ours. So it's something about that just time doesn't work the same for them.
Could one day in our world be 100 years and their world within the next day could be 2 seconds?
The rules are different. So, well, here's the thing, is that human beings have been they encounter a cultural system like reincarnation in Hinduism, or the age of the fairies in British lore. And some scholars will break their heads trying to make all the numbers work out right. Or they'll try to figure out how everybody relates to each other, and so they'll try to systematize that, and it never works. I mean, it never all comes together because storytelling traditions. So, for example, one of my favorite versions of this, I was once doing field work in the Southwest, and there was a Native American who was telling a story, and the story, and it's several refrains in the story he would say in English, and this is the way we've always told the story. This is this is what they say. So those two phrases over and over. This is what they say. And this is the way we've always told the story. That story had sailboats, Ford pickup trucks, Winchester rifles, and the coyote trickster from the beginning of time, all in them. And he said, and this is the way we've always told the story. And he meant something by that that's connected with, like, why you can't tell what the age of the Fae are. He meant something by that. And that is that we retell the story each generation, or rewrite the love song each generation. That's us telling the story in the way that it's always been told, because we let it live. And that's what we mean by an oral tradition, too. Is it alive? It lives. And so that's why the elves today shouldn't have tricorn hats and, medieval livery. They should look like us. And then maybe they're real short or funny looking, or they have a humpback or wings, or, there's odd things about them, but.
I did want to ask about that. When did all the Fae people all become small? Is that a new thing? Or
19th century.
Is that a 19th century?
That's a 19th century thing. And
because you mentioned Grendel earlier, and
yeah.
I was like, that's not as small.
Yeah, so most of history, most of these historical traditions, the Fae folk are either indecipherable from other human beings, so they just look like people, except that they can change into animals. So they're not just like people. But when you see them dancing on the hillside, there's always been this weird story about, as you get closer and closer and closer, it seems to get farther and farther and farther away. And so maybe they're really small, or maybe they're just like time, that size isn't, and they all are called the fair folk or the wee folk, because sometimes, but for the most part, these little tiny Tinkerbell type fairies, that's Victorian romance lore. It's an artistic style. We might think of it as like Art Deco. Is that fairies look like this is a British art phenomena.
Is there some sort of historic relation between the concept of a druid or a shape changer, like a man who is in some way heavily tied to nature, and a fairy?
Yeah. So the thing is that in the so witchcraft trials, we may be out of time. Shall we start wrapping up, or should
Probably start wrapping up. I think that I answered this question, but I was going to ask you to talk a little bit about the Macbeth witches before we get out of here, just to touch on that a little bit. But
Yeah.
We'll head that direction.
Witchcraft, witch hunt, witch trials become popular in around the time, a little bit before Shakespeare's time, but are not that common in terms of, we do have the Inquisition, which historically we understand somewhat differently, although in its sort of popular cultural representations, it's doing the same kind of stuff. But one of the things that happens that gets investigated and persecuted is if somebody shows up in public and says, well, we should all agree together on what to do with the orchard. So voting, or owning things in common, or that the priests shouldn't have all the grain or the money, so a great deal of the Inquisition, a great deal of it is social change that we now call the democratic revolutions and the capitalist revolution, like all those things that happened in modernity. The bootloader for those were a bunch of movements that got squished. Fairly, the novel The Name of the Rose tells this story pretty well and pretty accurately, historically speaking. So that's a worthwhile, that's a way you can get some access to how some of these were political and social philosophies. And so, witches eating babies is not a historical phenomenon. That's a thing you say about someone who it's like political mudslinging. It's someone that you want to undermine. And so almost all the witch lore and what comes out in these trials, it's just recycled old fairy stories, but it's human women instead of the fairy queen. The fairy queens are noted. So like we see with Titania, there's a whole cycle of fairy queens that get in feuds with each other over the love of one of the fairy princes. And there's this famous one in which this one fairy queen's magic wasn't quite as good as her rival. And the rival's pretty nasty and dislikable, but she keeps getting turned into a cat over and over. And has to be a pet cat in the other queen's court, while the other queen is flirting with her husband or boyfriend or paramour, And so that turns into a witch story. And we didn't even get to it. I had a piece on goddesses because the fairies are a certain kind of goddess tradition connected with nature, and witch stories, human witch stories, are a recycling of certain kinds of goddess stories, and they're almost always invented by dudes with some kind of axe to grind. And so they're a product of a very complicated product of patriarchal culture. Now there were women who were midwives who would also perform abortions, might curse someone or have a love potion or make, an adulterer impotent using some kind of herbal medicine or just the evil eye. So there's that kind of, but usually that was someone who's a medical practitioner and a grandma. That was known for, so there's no wicked witch that eats children. But you can see how if there was someone who birthed children and also performed abortions, hedge witch, that's a witch that lives outside the village and you sneak out there to go get her services, that can get turned into this other kind of story. And Macbeth. And the witches.
Yeah, I already touched on it a little bit, but the idea of whether or not they had anything to do with the plot of the play, and how in a lot of productions they get moved around. That people tend to either cut one of the witch scenes or they cut Hecate out of it, or they change, they move where the witch scenes happen to help make the story flow a little bit better. And at brass tacks, if they are affecting him or he is affecting them, or vice versa. Just your general thoughts about that. For another 2 hours.
Shoot. Let me, it's very hard for me to be brief, but I will attempt to do a speed run through the first part of that in order to get to what I think is the more interesting part that you're asking, and that is the three witches are always it's the old Neolithic goddess tradition of that all women, all female animals, especially ones like cows that we use for living, are an expression of a supernatural power that's usually associated with the sun in Neolithic period, later the moon. But in the Neolithic period, and it's this universal Mediterranean goddess, which we don't have direct access to, because by the time we start getting references to her, she's already not the famous universal Neolithic goddess anymore. We know her as Inanna or Ishtar. She shows up in the Epic of Gilgamesh, but she's already lost her several thousand years of popularity. So Inanna, or the Neolithic goddess of heaven, earth, and the underworld, who appeared in the forms of a maiden, a mother, and a crone, or a maiden, a sexually mature woman, and an old lady. That was a prominent religious tradition for about 5,000 years. So longer than any surviving religious tradition that we have yet. So we have not had a tradition in the last 2,000 to 3,000 years. We do have ones that will probably last that long. But there's this very old tradition. And so the Fates and the Narns and the Frigga and Freya and Artemis and Athena, and there's all these goddess traditions that are expressions of fertility in its three forms. And that's the maiden, which that is infinite, untapped fertility expressed in innocence, creativity, creation. So that's why you have little girls wear the new dresses at Easter or come out to May Festival, is because they're this supercharged magical power that you just want to be around because it makes everybody healthy and happy. And so that's non-sexualized female energy. And then you've got the mature woman, so that's someone who's gone through puberty. So that could still be a young woman, but someone who's reproductively fertile. And then that's the go get it, make it real karma medicine. That's the they can either make love, they can make hate, or they can make babies, or they can make the family stable. They can take care of everything. You know, they're the ones that keep everybody surviving and stable. And that's the mother, love goddess, jealousy goddess. So she's got multiple roles, and they usually split out into different goddesses by the time we get like historic mythology. But really, that's all the same function, and that's the fertile female. And then there's the postmenopausal wise woman, who can also be a hag or a crone or a wicked witch or a dangerous creature. So the three forms of the goddess are coded to our human understanding of different stages of female fertility, and that they each have a kind of magic association with them that's natural and it doesn't require study. So wizards who are often male, they're modeled on a different thing. They're modeled on Odin, who has to sacrifice his eye to get knowledge. He has to trade stuff for it, and he has to work hard. He has to sacrifice stuff to get knowledge, and that's the ascetic wizard tradition, where you work hard to become a wizard. Females are naturally magical, and they can guide it in different ways. They can guide it into fertility or productivity or genius or arts. And so the maiden might be a prepubescent girl, but that also could be an adult celibate artist who does. So Saraswati is the goddess in Hinduism who is celibate, or it could be the huntress Artemis, who likes to hang out in the woods and hunt stuff. She's celibate, chaste, virginal. Athena, virginal, because she's the goddess of strategy and law and civic planning. And so these female natural magical powers can be channeled into different kinds of activities. And so these witches that appear in threes are a shared culture of triple witches that have been showing up in stories that we don't even have. And all the stories that we have, and part of their natural magic is that if we try to listen to them and learn from them by looking at the world around us, listening carefully, paying attention to others, if we try to open ourselves to the guidance of the world, and animals, stars, all kinds of things teach these things, then we'll know the path to take. However, like Macbeth, the story that usually happens with these three goddesses is that they'll make us a brew that will teach us the famous the superpower of history is flight. That was the one that all the ancient stories. So like the pinnacle of magical power was that you could fly, and you got it from these goddesses, and but you have to give them something. You have to sacrifice something, and what you sacrifice will shape the power of your flight. And so if you murder to interpret their often oracular but mysterious words, your flight will be violent, and you'll sail high, but you'll take others out. I mean, you'll take people with you when you go. If you share breath, that's like what the meditator, like the monk who sings songs and has a vow of silence and just shares their breath with them, or their life force, then you get things like, you hear the song of God, or, you live a long life and like to fish, and so, but one of the things, so the idea is say we've got the three witches, often cooking or weaving. And men for whom cooking and weaving are not natural powers. They can learn them through wizardry, but they're not natural powers. This is why Loki, who's a shape changer, a cross-dresser, and a trickster transformer of multiple genders, calls Odin sexist stereotypes. He calls him girly and makes fun. So Loki, who has been a mayor and a woman and all these other things, one of his great criticisms of Odin is he practices girl magic, and that he's not masculine enough. And Odin is the prototype of Santa Claus and Dumbledore and Merlin and all the, and so, but one of the things is we have these witches, and the pattern in this story is that a man can only know what to do in his life by keeping his eye on the goddesses as he backs through his life. Because if he turns away to do his own path, he'll lose the connection with what his wholesome fate ought to be. But he's also walking backwards. So he might run into things or fall in a hole. Now that was his fate, to fall in that hole. So he might avoid his fate by turning away from that tradition. And so if I was going to take a sort of shot in the dark, an elf shot in the dark, I would say that the Macbeth witches are uncanny in this Seelie way, or this she-fae way, in which they're not making it happen, except that they're making it happen. That Macbeth can turn away from that in exactly the same way that Antigone or Lear could turn away, but there's some necessity that drives them, and so so he's not controlled by the witches, but there's something about them that he can't help but do. I mean, I've sort of lost the articulation point, but it's this thing about goddess magic, is that they're always right, but the message is garbled or mysterious, so you don't know what the hell they're talking about.
Right. Well, from a literary standpoint, the play is less interesting
Yeah.
If he's forced to do it, then who cares, right?
Yeah, I think that the tradition to which those goddess witches are an heir is that he's not forced to do it. In simple terms, they don't force you to do anything. They give you information, and they sort of see how it's going to play out. But even the ancient Greeks, who had the concept of fate, moira, and ananke, necessity, they thought it was crappy, but they didn't think it was inescapable. Not exactly. They did think that it was something like that we experience the consequences of our own bad choices. Invariably, that those will catch up with us. And that, you can have bad luck and villains and stuff like that. That's my best effort.
I think it's great. I would, there's in the Christ story, you can say similar things. Like if Judas had to do what he had to do in order to move that story forward, who told Judas he had to do that? And did Judas have any choice at all? Because if he doesn't, was somebody else going to do it? Or,
Yeah.
So in a very similar situation to this, if the witches say, you're going to be Thane of Lungs, you're going to be Thane of Calder, you're going to be king. If he doesn't do anything, will that still happen? Or does he have to, will the king fall on a rake and kill himself? Will all the various things die of other things, and he would just take over the roles? Or maybe he wants it a little quicker than that.
Well, that's this thing about fairy time, too. I think it's another piece of this that shows up a lot in storytelling culture, and that is, do we move God's plan along, or do we let it unfold in its own time? Any culture, any time, any people have to weigh that, what it means to be who you're supposed to be, and does that include forcing the hand of fate or God, which some people have thought you do have to do, and some people have thought that that's a terrible idea. That's messing with the fairies,
It's that sort of eternal argument of what is omniscience, right?
Well, and see, this is one reason why our absolute categories of good and evil and omniscience and blah, 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 they just don't apply those to all this traditional lore. Almost in all the traditional lore, everybody has flaws, as well as strengths, kind of like people. And they don't attribute to supernatural reality inescapable, these paradoxical, inescapable questions. Thank you for having me.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's hear it for Dr. Jeffrey Ruff. I want to thank everybody for watching today that tuned in. These videos will be on YouTube, so you can watch them again if you missed them before. We want to thank the West Virginia Humanities Council for making all of this happen. Thank you all so much for that grant so we can do things like this with the West Virginia Shakespeare Festival. Let's hear it again for Dr. Ruff. Good night, everybody.